Quote, "But at length the desire got the better of him, and forcing his eyes open, he ran up to the dead body, saying to his eyes, 'Look, you wretches, take your fill of the fair sight.'" Unquote. He doesn't at all experience this as an episode of freedom. Quite the contrary. In general, this condition seems to call for some ability to detach oneself from the pull of such incentives and desires, and then to determine whether, as it is often said, I can identify with those desires and inclinations. If I do, then I can be said to act freely in such projects. If I don't so identify, feel somehow estranged from my own wants and desires, I couldn't be said to be acting freely, however unimpeded, however much the attempt can be said to be brought about by, caused by me and no one else. But what establishes the possibility of such real separation, and on what basis could I effect such an identification, especially given the fact that I didn't much determine how I got to be me and don't much determine the context and options within which I must try to become who I think I am? It's at this point that things start breaking down in modern philosophy into interminable controversies, disputes which, I think, reflect in some way the unresolved historical attempt of the project of securing a free life for all. For what does it now mean to be able to stand behind or own up to my own deeds and thereby identify them, recognize myself in them? Well, the role of reason has seemed important to philosophers from Socrates to Kant and John Stuart Mill. But you can take my word for it, there's very little agreement among philosophers about how much or how little we can expect from introducing that requirement, whatever it is, into the picture. This is so, for one reason, because any serious real-world reflection and deliberation must always already start somewhere fairly far down the road in an evaluation. And it seems a sheer fantasy to think that if we worked hard enough, we could pretend at some point not to be committed to anything and figure out just by thinking about it how human beings should act. Reflective evaluation always seems already to rest on the experience of something as hypocrisy, disloyalty, or generosity, and so forth. And none of us has ever or could ever reflectively assess all our commitments and evaluations to things like this from the ground up. We often like to think we can, in principle, always raise questions about anything, and so that we can always fulfill that condition that will establish such a rational connection between me as a subject and what I end up doing. Here I've only time to say that I side with those who think this is not only a naive view, but also a dangerous one, since it promotes a kind of practice that is often quite blind to a number of limitations that ought themselves to have decisive normative force. In fact, such a danger is evidence of a deeper one, since this bourgeois notion of freedom, for a variety of reasons having to do with an interest in making claims of entitlement and just desert, tends to exaggerate the extent of individual independence and even to identify the core notion of such a value, of free life, with autonomous independence, a sort of complete evaluative self-sufficiency. And here again we confront the issue we've seen before. If a free life is the only valuable life, and a free life means an independent life, and a human life is necessarily a profoundly dependent one, and a modern human life requires a depth and extent of dependence never before imaginable, how are we supposed to think about such independence, a life of one's own? I hope that a few concluding examples can help classify what I'm trying to get at. The historical problem emerging in the literature I want to look at, I'm suggesting, concerns the very confusing experience of extensive social dependencies within a kind of life guided by a rather extreme demand for this sort of independence. Consider how a particular unresolved complexity manifests itself, given that all the notions we've discussed as relevant to a free life, justifiability, reason-giving, identification, all presuppose some way of having established, already settled in common, a number of the very simplest preliminary issues. What it is that you're actually doing, something that can itself be quite contestable, and that requires some way of understanding such act descriptions as involving profound social dependencies. I know it sounds vague and too literary to suggest that we find in these documents some extended attempt to work through in some way this unresolved legacy of the bourgeois turn in history. But perhaps a few examples will help, and since I'm giving the talk, I get to pick my favorite authors. In one of the novels of Henry James, The Wings of the Dove, an extraordinarily intelligent woman, Kate Croy, befriends an American heiress, Millie Thiel, who is dying. Kate sees that Millie has fallen in love with one Merton Densher, with whom Kate herself is secretly engaged. Kate and Merton have not married and kept everything secret because for them, given their tastes and ambitions, their desire for freedom, a marriage with no money would be enslaving, miserable, and they hope a solution may come along. Kate's solution is to have her boyfriend make love to Millie, the rich heiress, marry her, and then after the inevitable death, Kate and Merton can live happily ever after on Merton's vast inheritance. One of the great achievements of the novel is how good Kate is in convincing Merton and us that what they are doing is not deceiving a dying heiress. What they are doing is actually allowing a friend, Millie, to experience romantic love once before she dies. I can't do any justice here to just how good Kate is at this, and how profoundly different it would all seem if they had been successful, and Millie had died unknowing and blissfully happy. One might want to attribute Kate's eventual inability to somehow make this description stick to the social conventions, which in fact override her attempted redescription. Or one might want to say somehow that both descriptions could be true in their own way. But Kate is good enough at what she does to make it profoundly unclear just how such an issue should be settled, how our dependence on the way a putative description like this would enter and circulate in a real social world can be squared with our sense of the relative independence we want to assert about what we sincerely intended to do and what role that should play in some determination of what was done. But James goes the other way, too, does not just throw doubt on the independence of agents' descriptions in favor of the more standard or socially authoritative ones. In The Ambassadors, the conventional or socially authoritative view of the relationship between a young male heir, dawdling years too long in Paris, and the married Parisian woman with whom he dawdles, is that it is not serious, a mere bagatelle, potentially corrupting, and that the boy should come home. The ambassador sent there to bring him home, Lambert Strether, ends up disputing this description, seeing instead a world of great subtlety, sensitivity, and complexity that it must be good for Chad, the heir, to experience. This divergence from the norm, this assertion of independence, ends up costing Strether everything. The boy's mother is Strether's employer, benefactor, and potential future wife. And James here manages to persuade us that Strether's independent view is correct, although it's shared by no one else, and it remains quite mysterious how we know he's right. This is especially so because we keep faith with Strether and his independence even after we learn that the conventional view had been largely correct, that Chad is a thoughtless playboy and hasn't much been helped at all by his so-called education. Novels testify in many ways to the great limitations of any notion of freedom that exaggerates this claim of independence, an exaggerated pretense of independence that, I'm suggesting, is the chief bourgeois temptation. Perhaps the most prominent and well-known are the dilemmas about romantic love and marriage. Three of the greatest of the 19th century novels, Flaubert's Emma Bovary, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and Fontaine's Ephebristes, are about adultery, and just thereby already raise a number of issues about the perceived unfreedom of the institution of marriage, and so what it might mean to reestablish a connection between my sense of my own agency and my own deeds, as when Emma Bovary can say to herself in what amounts to a triumph of pathos, "I am having an affair." This sympathy is even true of the author in spite of himself, who is clearly out to write an anti-adultery novel, Tolstoy. To some extent, this is all a variation on a very large 19th century theme in the novel. Most everyone seemed to realize that while the self-understanding embodied in the ideal of modern romantic love between individuals was a very good way to get people married, to start them off at that necessary social institution, it wasn't at all a very good basis if you wanted people to stay married, for all the obvious reasons. But there is a deeper issue here that again brings to light in such documents dimensions of the ideal of a self-determining version of freedom that are, I think, philosophically significant. For the tension in the idea of a modern marriage